Okay, everyone, I think we're going to make a start. To introduce Lena Wirtz, who's a book art student from last year, and she's going to introduce Regina in the talk today. She's organised it. And she also has an amazing exhibition in the library to make sure that you get to see that.
I will introduce to you the catalogue we made in. Sorry, I'm really nervous. I will introduce to you the catalogue that we made for our summer exhibition last year, and I will use it to introduce Regine Ehleiter. She made a contribution to our catalogue, and she will introduce her PhD research, which relates to exhibitions of the 1960s and 70s that took place primarily on the pages of publications. And she will use, which I'm really excited about, her contribution to the catalogue as footnotes to her talk. So I quite like that the footnotes appear before the talk. This is her contribution, the first, the left-hand side of it. The rest is going to follow later. I will tell you about the concept of the catalogue rather than the production process. The catalogue is important in two ways. Firstly, as in how an exhibition and a publication that relate to the same event, that are about the same event, how they're related, and then also how work is represented on walls of an architectural space versus how work is represented on pages of a book. So for the catalogue, we invited 6 external, so us as a student group, we invited 6 external contributors, artists and curators, to make a contribution and to show their perspective on exactly this, how works can be exhibited on the pages of publications versus how they can be exhibited on walls in an architectural space. So it's important to mention that we saw the catalogue as a second room to exhibit in rather than a place where we would show a documentation of our exhibition. We were 8 students with the same brief as the external contributors. It was important for us also that there wasn't really a hierarchy, so there wasn't a section of graduates and a section of professionals. It was more about the catalogue as an object about our topic. So the only difference for us as students was that our contribution to the catalogue had to relate, or had to be about the same project that we also exhibited in the space. But I think it helped us thinking about our work as an independent project, because we had 2 spaces to present our work, so we really had to think of what is the essence and how do we bring it across in one space, how do we bring it across in another space. So these are just 2 perspectives of the room we had on during the summer show. And there's our catalogue sneaking in on the right-hand side. So in the physical exhibition space, visitors would walk through the space, and we could use the movement of the audience and their body in the curation. Now, in publications have the same attributes, but you go differently through a publication than you walk through a space. And most importantly, you can move the book with your body. And that's, I think, well, before starting the MA, my biggest interest in books, and it still is that they're portable and that you can distribute information through them. And you also don't have any of the limitations you have with galleries and shops opening times and such. So I always thought it would be interesting to bring the external contributors back into the space, out of the catalogue back into the space, just like we brought the space into the catalogue. And we did have our catalogue in the exhibition space, but I think we could have done more with that idea. So I'm really excited about this talk because bringing Regine in to talk about the footnotes she presented in the catalogue, essentially. That's for me kind of connecting the two spaces that we set up. That's my mum. She doesn't know that she's on a pink screen. I'm not gonna tell her. Before curating our works on the pages of the publication, we had to set up some frameworks that you would also meet when you come into an architectural space. So we had Clara, who's now in second year book arts, in the blue t-shirt, who was our graphic designer, and she helped us shape this space. So together with her, we came up, for example, with these insert sheets. Sorry, I just see that there's the little hand. We came up with these insert sheets that the idea was that you could take something out of the catalogue into the space. But also we used it, for example, for all the contact details of both external contributors and us students. So you could use it separately if you wanted to, just like contact cards or an exhibition flyer, for example. The insert sheets also suited some of the contributions. This one is by Claudia Della Torre. She's one of our external contributors. And this is one page of her contribution. So one of our restrictions was to place the contribution on a double page or recto verso page. And with her text, it suited really well to have it as a loose page because you need to turn it a lot to completely read the text. There's a lot of references that you need to go back and forth with. Then this is one of the student contributions by Charlotte. She worked about her grandma's dementia for the time of her MA. And her final piece was a really beautifully crafted, very thick album that had 4 different images that repeated. So this is one of them. And she used the traditional craft of book binding to explore loss and touch, loss of memory. And so the design choice of black and white printing and matte paper suited her really well because she also used that in her final piece, with the idea of when you go through the book, the ink would eventually transfer on fingertips and fade from the page. And in this case, it works really well to just have one page. It also works really well to have the repetition in her final piece in the architectural space. So the essence of the loss comes across in both approaches. Now, finally, this is one of probably my favorite part, the cover of the catalogue, because you're right inside imagining the space when you start reading the first word. It pulls you in, and that was one thing we thought about with Clara, signage of spaces, but now related to book design. And I like to think of this is the right-hand side part of Regine's contribution, and I like to think of her contribution as like the entrance and the exit of our space. Both because of where it's positioned and the inside of the cover and on the inside of the back. And also because of its content, it's kind of like a like a research space or like a bookshop at the end of an exhibition that you pick up from and that you take further. And now I will hand over to Regine. I'll tell you a little bit about her. She's a German curator and author, and she's currently based in London working on her PhD research that I mentioned at the beginning. In 2015, she received a doctoral grant by the German Academic Exchange Service, which allowed her to study the Seth Sieglaub papers at MoMA and the Lucy Lippard papers at the Archives of American Art in DC. And she also cited materials at the Getty Research Institute in LA. She's published and lectured about on contemporary exhibition history, and she wrote an essay for the book that I remembered we looked into in our reading group last year, Books and Ideas After Seth Sieglaub, which I think is also on the table that I should have mentioned at the beginning, which we will end our talk with. In kind of an informal way, we can speak about the works she brought and that she's going to present to you now. She's also teaching at the moment as a visiting lecturer at the Goethe University in Frankfurt on the MA Curatorial Studies on Sieglaub and expanded notions of display. And Regine and I met in Baden-Baden, where she joined the curatorial team of the Staatliche Kunsthalle in 2011. I was an intern, and she was working on an exhibition about wall works. There were works by Solowit, for example, and Lawrence Wiener. And she also introduced me to the project she set up at the Kunsthalle called Publishers Corner, which was a display module to, used to invite independent publishers to the little town of Baden-Baden. And she also introduced me to the term artist's book, which I didn't know existed before. That's the last thing. She was awarded in 2016 a curatorial fellowship, which led to the exhibition What's Unfolding. And it's very exciting. She invited artists to develop projects specifically for display in the catalogue. So thank you very much. That's her website. And that's you.
Thank you. I should say Lena was really more of a conversation partner than an intern, or in any case the best intern I ever had. So yeah, thanks for coming and for the introduction, for the MA Book Arts class, for inviting me to speak today. As you already mentioned, my talk, wait, I need the keynote, will be loosely based on the photograph you see here behind me and on the books displayed on that little table. I took that photograph in May last year when I was still living in Germany, and Lena invited me to contribute to their final show catalogue. And you already said it, I called the contribution Visual Footnotes to a Dissertation Underway. And that is because in some way or another, all of these books relate to my PhD topic, where I look at curatorial projects of the 60s and 70s, which really blurred the boundaries between what an exhibition and what a publication is. So in some of the case studies, a book or a magazine was really the only physical trace of an exhibition, and there was no gallery exhibition in the conventional sense. The exhibition was conceived for the catalogue. In other cases, something was shown in the gallery, but the publication expanded this gallery installation, as some of the artist projects were shown only in the publication, a bit like the final show catalogue that you just showed. And thirdly, there's a number of books or monographs about such curious curatorial endeavors on this table. And in the next 45 minutes, try to be quick, I'll come back to this image time and again, and I'll try to navigate my way through it by zooming in on some of the books and to really unpack the notion of the publication as exhibition a little bit and to give more context. While doing so, you'll notice that I'll repeatedly mention a number of terms that are of significance for this topic, such as documentation, dematerialization, and display. And I'll explain them as we move along, and I'll start actually right away with the term documentation. It's you already brought it up in your introduction, and it's a concept, a word that most of the MA Book Art students, I suppose, will have encountered in definitions of artist books. The term documentation is often used to distinguish an artist book from an exhibition catalog, or more generally from other secondary documentary material. French art historian Anne-Muglaine Delcroix, who wrote this massive book on artist books that you see on the left, Esthétique du livre d'artiste, you probably know that. She wrote, "The work is an end in itself, while the document is a means at the service of something else." So in other words, the work, and here I'm talking about the artist's book, is autonomous, it's self-sufficient, it doesn't need to do anything. The catalog, however, is usually considered a document and at the service of something else. It has to perform a task, it has a function. Now, what is the catalog's function? You all know this. Typically, it serves to show what was on view in a gallery, and it wants to archive or preserve that knowledge for future times, kind of beyond the ephemeral existence of an exhibition and the objects it displayed in it. So exhibition and catalog have very different temporalities. One usually lasts only for a few weeks and can be seen solely by visiting a certain space. The other, the catalog, is made to last for a long time and to circulate to sometimes really unforeseen places. Its content can be read by multiple people in different locations at the same time, and thus it can, at least in principle, have a sort of worldwide reach. This idea that one could organize an exhibition that stretches out to different places all over the world in form of a catalog is at the center of the first project that I would like to talk about today. It's the July, August, September 1969 exhibition. It was put together by the American art dealer, publisher, and impresario of sorts, Sas Siegelaup, after his return from a longer trip to Europe. Siegelaup was at the time very invested in the idea to decentralize the art world. In an interview titled "On Exhibitions and the World at Large" that appeared in the British art magazine Studio International in the same year as the show, he wrote, "I think New York is beginning to break down as a center, not that there will be another city to replace it, but rather that where any artist is will be the center. International activity. It is more important to send artists to exhibitions than to send art." So in case you never heard the name Seth Siegelaup before, I'll introduce him really briefly. He worked as an art dealer in New York in the 60s. He also had his own gallery for a while, Seth Siegelaup Contemporary Art. He had to close that in 1966 because of the high overhead costs kind of wasn't working out financially. But he's really known for promoting a group of artists, among them Robert Barry, Douglas Hubler, Solowit, and Lawrence Weiner, or Joseph Cassutt, of course. And after closing his gallery, he mainly operated from his apartment in Manhattan. And so there, between 68 and 71, Siegelaup organized a number of exhibitions for which publications constituted the only tangible or visual manifestation of the show. And so these publications include bound catalogs, and here I'm expanding my table a little bit for some other books that I didn't have at home when I took the picture. It also included magazine sections, and even an inlay in a fair catalog of the Prospect 69 art fair in Düsseldorf. It also included postcards, posters. The posters here, it's a very wide, big thing. There's just a bit of text in the bottom. You probably can't read that. and even a wall calendar, such as here for the March 69 exhibition, or also called 1 month, where he asked artists to contribute an artwork for every day of that month. So everyone had one page, basically, in that little catalogue. Siegelab's conceptual projects, alongside those by New York art critic Lucy Lepard, and here you see just a few cards of her famous Numbers Show catalogue, and there's a reprint as well on the table, are probably the best known examples for the relocation of the exhibition space into printed media. And now I'm coming back to July, August, September 69. For this exhibition, Siegelab asked 11 artists to each make one work in one location anywhere in the world. In a letter to Peter Townsend, the editor of Studio International, he further explained, "The entire exhibition will be tied together with a catalogue in English, German, and French, which will serve as a guide to the exhibition throughout the world. It will have no critical writing, just facts." And really note these 3 different languages. I think it has become pretty standard today to translate a catalogue into different, or into more than one language, at least if it isn't in England or in the US. But this wasn't as common in the 1960s, and really reflects Siegelab's wish to decentralize the art world. The catalogue was divided into 2 parts, and these yellowish figures, I inserted them myself, they're not part of the catalogue. The first part consisted of the works in the form of descriptions, photographs, and maps. And the participants, just to name a few, are, for example, Carl André, who happened to be in The Hague at the time, Daniel Buren in Paris, Jan Dibbets in Amsterdam, Douglas Hubler in Los Angeles, Robert Smithen, who was in Yucatan, and Lawrence Wiener in the Niagara Falls, Netgo from Vancouver, and so on and so forth. The second, much shorter part of the catalogue listed very specific information that visitors needed to actually find these locations on site. And Siegelab, in his letter of invitation, wrote to the 11 artists, "Please keep in mind that people will want to see the work of art with just the information in the catalogue as their only guide." So he really emphasizes the importance of the publication for this ambitious exhibition project. So to give one example from the catalogue, this is Jan Dibbets, Dutch artist Jan Dibbets' piece. He called it a travel piece, and it encompasses these 6 photographs on the left, a map, as well as a schedule with departure and arrival times of certain ferries in Holland. And in a letter to Siegelab, Dibbets described that the piece would consist of a non-moving part, and that is a mass of land, as well as a moving part, and that would be the sculpture in form of the visitors. His idea was really that following the schedule, every participant would be making the same movements over a landmass, starting in Amsterdam, and thus the visitors would become a part of the piece. In order to make this trip, one had to exactly follow the schedule included in the catalogue, and it contained not only information about departure times and instructions, but also instructions for taking photographs at 6 sites along the route. Dibbets understood these photographs of the sea as visual bridges connecting the islands to each other with visual links. And these photographs, the hand-drawn map and the information on departure and arrival times, were really the only form of documentation of Dibbets' work. Even if you hadn't actually made the trip, the work existed through that documentation. So what appears to be merely a collection of facts suddenly also assumes the status and the function of the work itself. And this approach is very characteristic for many of the conceptualist practices in the 1960s and 70s. And to come back to the term documentation, it really changes at that time, and it's becoming more complex because of the ways in which artists and exhibition organizers made use of photography and publications to display art and not just to document it. And the fact that this works so well really has to do with the nature of the works we encounter here, which are often described as dematerialized. To quote Siegelaup, the type of art that I'm involved with and concerned about has less to do with materiality than ideas and intangible considerations. And so the needs for presentation of the work are quite a bit different than just putting up walls and making them available to artists, which is what a gallery does. His description seems to echo a concept that was coined by art critics Lucy Lepard and John Chandler in a now famous article titled The Dematerialization of Art, published in 1968 in the American art magazine Art International. And here they describe the development of an ultra-conceptual art that emphasizes the thinking process almost exclusively. Such a trend appears to be provoking a profound dematerialization of art, especially of art as object, and if it continues to prevail, it may result in the objects becoming wholly obsolete. This term dematerialization was, on the one hand, interestingly, heavily criticized. For example, Terry Atkinson from the British Art and Language Group articulated his critique. He objected to the accuracy of the term dematerialization because what it suggests is basically a complete absence of materials. And it seems to neglect the fact that even a piece of paper or a photograph are in fact material objects. But on the other hand, the term dematerialization was instantly accepted and really became a key word for characterizing the conceptual strategies that artists developed in the 60s and 70s. So Lepard further elaborated on her ideas in this 1972 book. It's maybe some of you have seen it before. It's an anthology of practices, artworks, and events and exhibitions that happened in the 6 years from 1966 to 1972. In the postface of the book, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, not the preface, but at the end, the postface, she expresses her frustration concerning the thwarted hopes and failed potentials of dematerialized art to actually circumvent the commercial gallery system. And even though this text, she reads, is a bit frustrated, her text is still a very good summary of the practices that she was referring to in the first place, which is why I want to give a bit of a longer quote. Only the second part is on the slide. It seemed that in 1969, that no one, not even a public greedy for novelty, would actually pay money, or much of it, for a Xerox sheet referring to an event past or never directly perceived, or for a group of photographs documenting an ephemeral situation or condition, a project for work never to be completed, words spoken but not recorded. It seemed that these artists would therefore be forcibly freed from the tyranny of a commodity status and market orientation. Clearly, whatever minor revolutions in communication have been achieved by the process of dematerializing the object, easily mailed work, catalogs and magazine pieces, primarily art that can be shown inexpensively and unobtrusively in infinite locations at one time, art and artists in a capitalist society remain luxuries. So Lepard was, as I mentioned, involved in a number of exhibitions of dematerialized art. I mentioned the numbers, shows, catalogs, but I would now like to zoom in on another project that she was part of, and it's in a way a successor to the July, August, September 69 exhibition that I just talked about before. Because Siegelaup already in 69 had hoped that this first exhibition would come out as an insert to Studio International magazine, which really had a large reach and was widely read at the time. And a year later, in the summer of 1970, the collaboration he had hoped for then actually takes shape, and Peter Townsend, the editor of Studio International, now supports his idea to treat the magazine's pages as an exhibition site. Jo Melvin, who's a reader here at Chelsea College of Art and has presented an in-depth study of Studio International with her dissertation, she pointed out that this was the first time that a mainstream art magazine had presented itself as an art exhibition, and underlined that the magazine's pages exclusively formed the exhibition with no further gallery presentation. The exhibition was titled July-August 1970, with reference to the simple fact that this was the July-August issue of Studio International. The cover, which Siegelab had designed, listed a number of names set in white on a grey background. On the contents page, readers would find a very matter-of-fact statement that briefly summed up Siegelab's concept. It read, the content of the 48-page exhibition in this issue was organized by requesting 6 critics to each edit an 8-page section of the magazine, and in turn to make available their section to the artists that interest them. The 6 critics that had agreed to participate in the project were David Anton from Los Angeles, Germano Zeland from Genoa in Italy, Michel Clorat, who lived in Paris, Charles Harrison, who worked for Studio International and covered the UK, Lucy Lepard, New York-based and the only woman, and lastly, Hans Strelo from Germany. Their approaches really differ very much, and I can't go into detail for all of them. I just want to mention maybe what really sticks out. For example, here, Michel Clorat's section, he was the only critic who invited only one artist, Daniel Buren. You might recognize his yellow-white stripes. He was also the only one to insist on color printing and for this in situ work that really unfolds over 8 pages. And of the sections with several artists involved, Lepard's, I think, probably worked best as a coherent entity. She had provided the artists with a short instruction, which was reproduced at the beginning of her section, and I'll read that. Each artist is to provide a situation within which the next artist is to work. He, in turn, will do a piece within the situation provided him by the artist before him on the list. And then she says, this way the section would become a kind of carrier piece in itself. So just to explain, for instance, you would have on Carrara's telegram piece where it says, I am still alive on Carrara. And then Sol-LeWitt reacts to this piece on the next page, and with this kind of poem varying the different words that form the sentence, I am still alive on Carrara. So it starts with I am still alive on Carrara, onto I am still on Carrara, I am still on Carrara, and so on and so forth, up to the question, am I still on Carrara, and so on. So this really worked very nicely as kind of carrier piece, the way she imagined it. And also one should say that the kind of art presented in this magazine exhibition really favored such a presentation in the magazine. It was not object-based art, obviously, but the artists mainly used language and visual systems to foreground their ideas. And even though their works didn't involve the production and presentation of physical objects in a gallery, I think it is still very crucial to not forget that the magazine in which we encounter them in is such a physical material object. And because when talking about dematerialization, it's often neglected that publications which serve to display such dematerialized work itself have a material presence. And in fact, the materiality of the magazine and that of the works here, for instance, are the same, or is the same. The publication and the piece, to a certain degree, become indistinguishable from one another. And Robert Barry alluded to this coalescence of the work and its surrounding material support by means of 2 really fantastic magazine pieces from '69, which explicitly address the page as such, defining it in terms of its physicality. So I'm talking about these 2 pieces he did for issue 6 of the magazine 0 to 9, which was the stapled, simple American magazine by 2 American artists and poets, Vito Acconci and Bernadette Meyer. They had started in New York in 1967, I think. And Barry's works are listed in the contents page of the magazine, just as the space between pages 29 and 30, and the space between pages 74 and 75. And that's it. The work existed of nothing else but these two entries on the contents page. And in the first case, what he's referring to is the very thin space between, recto and verso of a page. It's seemingly no space at all, but because this page has almost no volumetric presence, but I guess almost really is the key, because what he refers to is by locating his work between the pages 29 and 30, he points our attention to the infinitesimal thickness of that sheet of paper. And in the second case, the space between pages 74 and 75, it is the space between two pages that were facing each other. In fact, two poems of sorts. So it's kind of the title refers to the negative space that fills the air between two pages. And Barry, in my interpretation here, is alluding to the very act of reading, which consists of turning the pages, but also to the relationship between the works in a magazine and how one work is maybe affected by its neighbor and how they are put in relation to each other. And this question of how works are positioned, how they're put in context or in relation to each other, is very pertinent to exhibition display more generally, and to the ways in which selected works interact in a presentational situation. Now, when you hear the term display, what most people will think of is, I guess, how certain works are presented in a gallery, in a museum, in a certain architectural setting or building. And let me run you through some of the elements that are usually considered to be part of an exhibition display. So first and foremost, it refers to the way certain objects or exhibits are positioned in space, right? This is an installation view of Harald Seemann's legendary exhibition, When Attitudes Become Form, 1969, at the Kunsthalle in Bern. And it shows a very unusual positioning of objects. That's why I picked it. Just to say that objects can be read, as you know, very differently depending on which setting or context they are shown in. And thus the positioning of objects contributes to the meaning of an exhibition and its elements. But also there's aspects of visitor guidance, such as wall texts and any kind of written information that's given out that forms part of the display. And here you see a panel and a wall text installed to guide visitors through the 2013 reconstruction of When Attitudes Become Form at the Venice Biennial, which was at the Prada Foundation. Then, of course, the exhibition catalog itself also forms part of the display of an exhibition, as well as other published materials such as flyers and posters, and not to forget the lighting and color design of the walls, which create atmosphere but also meaning. And obviously, When Attitudes Become Form in 2013 here is a bit of a special case, because what they try to do is reconstruct an exhibition that took place in one space at the Kunsthalle in Bern in '69, and to reconstruct, to rebuild it in another completely different gallery space at the Prada Foundation in Venice. And the last element of display I want to mention concerns certain aids, such as vitrines, display cases, or pedestals, as well as the very lack of pedestals, which is then also a statement. Just drink. So what you have noticed is that most of these elements of display really relate to architectural settings, and the building, the architecture of a gallery space in the strict sense. Now you might wonder what on earth this has to do with the projects on my desk. And at first sight, these exhibition projects really diverge very much from how exhibitions usually look like. But please put this idea of how an exhibition usually looks like, typically looks like, aside for a second and maybe start a thought experiment with me. Because given that these projects were in fact seen as exhibitions, I think, or I would like to propose to try and actually read them and discuss them by using the very language of exhibition making. And that would mean to apply the terms and terminology of display to such publications, publication exhibitions. So if one considers, by way of example, the Xerox book, Siegelhaupt's probably best known exhibition in catalogue form, then both the potential but also the limitations of transferring the concept of display to exhibitions in printed media become apparent. This exhibition, this group exhibition, officially published in December 1968 under the title Carl Andre, Robert Barry, Douglas Hubler, Joseph Cassuth, Sol DeWitt, Robert Morris, and Lawrence Riener, contained 7 contributions by said artists, of each 25 pages, that were created specifically for the book by using the new technology of photocopying. Instead of a traditional opening in the exhibition space, Siegelhaupt had small cards printed which contained an invitation to a cocktail party on Friday, 13th December 1968, at the Park Avenue apartment of John W. Wendler, who co-published the Xerox book. So if you can't read this, it says, Mr. Seth Siegelhaupt and Mr. John W. Wendler invite you to cocktails to introduce the Xerox book at the apartment of Mr. and Mrs. John Wendler. And this is fairly dark because I'm showing a mock-up of this card from Siegelhaupt's archive. That's why it looks a bit blurry. The cover and back of the 207-page catalogue, which was printed on very thin paper, are completely white. They are, I think, reminiscent of the clean, bright walls of the white cube, and seem to embody Siegelhaupt's idea of a standardized, seemingly neutral exhibition situation. He talks about this idea in greater length in that interview that I showed before on exhibitions in the world at large, if you want to read up on this. And really, this ambition to create as neutral a situation as possible is pursued further in the book's interior design. Here you have this memorable title page, which contained the artists' names in capital letters and in alphabetical order, as well as information concerning publisher, edition, place, year, and copyright, all of which really reduced to an absolute minimum. And I think one can say that the list of names in the book resembles the kind of artist list that you often find plotted on the wall in the first room of a gallery space if you walk in. And on the next page, Siegelhaupt announces the first artistic contribution, which is on an almost completely empty sheet, only the name Carl Andre at its center. And in the book, all artists are allotted the same number of pages, and thus the same amount of space for the presentation of the work. And this is, of course, something that would be hardly possible in any other institutional setting of a gallery, not least because of architectural restraints, to give every artist the same space, same amount of space. So the meaning of the works in the Xerox book is revealed through turning the pages, and thus through an active movement akin to looking at an installation from different perspectives in a gallery space. Carl Andre's contribution, which you see here now, clearly illustrates this. It featured a continually increasing number of black squares randomly placed on the copying surface. So let me wait until I'm through with 25 squares. Yeah, this is it. In the Xerox book, instead of pedestals or showcases or other aids that would be used in a gallery display, I would argue that it is the graphic design that serves as a visual aid for the presentation of the works on the page. So in other words, Siegelhaupt's really careful selection of typefaces and his numerous detailed decisions concerning paper grammage, printing type, format, and publication size that he decided upon. So you find these leaflets, many of them in his archive, as well as a number of sketches and mock-ups that he produced for every publication. So every part of the design was really in the hands of Siegelhaupt, and there was no graphic designer as an intermediary figure as you would usually have today. This is really just a very brief consideration of a number of elements in the Xerox book, or elements of display in the Xerox book, and there are many more analogies to be drawn, but I'll have to keep it a bit short. And so one aspect that might have come across, I hope, is that the publication as exhibition is characterized by a very close link between the exhibited works with their presentational context. The specific material properties of the book really also define the aesthetic scope of the works. And in the Xerox book, this is really easy because the works were specifically created for display in the publication, and they are, in the sense, one could say, site-specific. So projects such as this one may therefore be understood as part of a development towards an increasing interlocking of art and context. You could also think of wall works, for example, of that time, which also were made specifically for a wall, and thus become one with that context of the gallery space. So it's kind of the same thing that happens. In the 1960s, this symbiotic relationship between exhibition space and conceptual forms of artistic production led to a growing recognition of the creative role of exhibition organizers, today we would say curators, in the process of producing, communicating, and publishing art, as well as to the emergence of a curatorial discourse decisively bolstered by Siegelhaupt's projects. And this is a picture of him finally, not a very famous but not very favorable picture of him in his living room in his apartment in Manhattan, taken in '69, I think. So to summarize, the transfer of the notion of display to printed media is inextricably linked to the question as to what an exhibition could be under changing parameters of artistic production. And this self-reflexivity, thinking about what the exhibition could be, is paradigmatic for a discursive turn that began in the 1960s and through which the questioning of the presentation format has become an axiomatic condition of contemporary critical exhibition practice. And this really brings us now back to the shift to the contemporary, to the left part of my table. And it would be too much to go into that now. I'm not going to do that. But you see a number of these projects that continue the legacy of, or that continue with this idea of blurring the boundaries between exhibition and publication today, much like the final show catalog that you described. And yeah, if you're interested in an overview of more projects that continue the legacy of Siegelhaupt, and specifically, you already mentioned this little book, Books and Ideas After Seth Siegelhaupt. There is, among many of the projects, there's also an interview with Seth Siegelhaupt that Michalis did. He was the last to interview Siegelhaupt before he died, passed away in 2013. And then you also already mentioned this, there's a text that I wrote on a number of these contemporary projects, but I also try to discuss the context of the original projects and to elaborate really on the specific context in which they're situated in, the political aims that underscored his practice, but also conceptual art more generally. So for example, the promise of making art accessible to a wider public that will require no privileged understanding, the promise of decentralizing the art world, of de-emphasizing the commodities object in favor of an art for all, or the idea that artist books would be available in supermarkets, drugstores, and airports, as Lucy Lepard has famously called for. This obviously never happened. 90% of art is still, maybe 99% of art is still presented in the old general white cube model, which really privileges the display of marketable objects. But I think the promise that there could be a change in the art system, that art could be based on a more democratic model, and that everyone could have access to exhibitions and art no matter their background and where they lived, this promise is still there, and it shows in the many projects that continue the legacy. And they're often a bit more playful, not as rigid or minimal as the ones from the 60s. But I'm really happy now to, if you like, to talk about these projects in a more casual way here at the book table. And thank you for listening.